The dogs weren't just barking, they were mourning. That was the only word Sergeant First Class Tatum could think of when she stood outside the Equine Therapy Center's newly converted canine unit on a Tuesday morning in early March, a clipboard pressed to her chest and her stomach slowly turning to ice. The sound coming from inside Building 14 wasn't aggression, not exactly. It was grief dressed up as rage, and she had heard enough of both to know the difference. 7 dogs. 7 retired military working dogs, each with a service record that would have made a general weep with pride, and not one of them capable of being approached without a handler losing blood. The Army's Wounded Warrior Canine Integration Program had seemed like such a clean idea on paper. Pair traumatized veterans with dogs who needed purpose, heal both at once. Brilliant, elegant. The kind of program that got colonels promoted and press releases written. What nobody had accounted for was the dogs arriving before the infrastructure did. Their handlers, the men and women who had been their whole world for years, had already rotated out, retired, reassigned, medically discharged. To the dogs, they had simply vanished, and into that void had rushed something terrible and shapeless, something that had no name in any training manual Tatum had ever read. She looked down at the incident log in her hand. 7 entries in the last 4 days, 2 handlers with lacerations, 1 with a fractured wrist, a kennel technician who had requested immediate reassignment and, by all accounts, wasn't coming back. The dogs had names like Ranger and Vega and Ajax, and they had been to Fallujah and Helmand, and places that didn't appear on unclassified maps, and now they were falling apart inside a climate-controlled facility in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and nobody could figure out why, which meant nobody could figure out how to stop it. Ma'am. Corporal Finney appeared at her elbow, 23 years old, with the permanent expression of someone expecting bad news. Colonel Ashworth's office called again. Tatum didn't look up from the clipboard. What'd you tell them? That the program was progressing. Is that what we're calling it? Finney said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. She knew what the colonel's interest meant. The program was 6 weeks from its congressional review. 6 weeks from either a funding renewal or a very public termination. The DoD did not enjoy press coverage of military dogs being euthanized because a well-intentioned program had placed them in an environment that broke them faster than combat had. Tatum had been brought in to turn this around, and she had 2 master's degrees and 15 years of animal behavior work and a track record that looked good in briefing slides, and she was standing outside this building listening to 7 heroes destroy themselves. And she had nothing. No protocol covered this. She had checked. Inside, she could hear Ranger throwing himself against the kennel wall again. The impact was rhythmic, almost mechanical. It had been going on for 2 hours. She pushed through the door. The smell hit her first. Disinfectant and stress hormones, and something underneath it all that she could only describe as despair. The facility was clean, well lit, temperature controlled. It was also completely wrong, and the dogs knew it before any human did. They were in individual runs along both walls, and as she entered, the decibel level climbed immediately. 7 voices, 7 versions of the same broken frequency. A Belgian Malinois named Ajax was spinning in tight, frantic circles, his nails scoring the concrete. A Dutch shepherd called Booker stood with his back to the room and simply shook. And there was Ranger, the dog she had read the most about. An enormous German shepherd with 3 combat deployments, and a Silver Star commendation attached to his handler's record, launching himself at the fence with a sustained fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle. Corporal Nystrom, the program's most experienced remaining handler, was standing in the middle of the room with the look of a man waiting for a verdict. He was good. Tatum knew he was good. He cared deeply, and he was following every protocol correctly, and it wasn't working, and he knew it, and knowing it was eating him alive. "Any change?" she asked, though she already knew. "Jax took feed this morning," Nystrom said. "Booker didn't. Ranger's been at it since 0400. He paused. "I filed a welfare concern report last night, ma'am. I had to." She nodded. She had read it before she arrived. It was the most careful, most professionally worded document she had ever seen someone write about dogs that were losing their minds, and it had made her feel sick. "I know," she said. "You did the right thing." The sound was relentless. She stood in the center of it and tried to think clearly and found it nearly impossible. Every animal instinct she had was screaming at her to leave. Then the sound changed. It didn't diminish. It sharpened. 7 dogs, each in their own private hell, suddenly unified. Their attention swung toward the far end of the building, toward the maintenance access door that connected to the facility's utility corridor. They pressed forward against their fences, their barks deepening, their posture shifting from frantic to focused. Tatum turned. The maintenance door swung open and an old man walked in. He was perhaps 70, perhaps older, the kind of age that settles unevenly across a person depending on what they have survived. He wore canvas work pants and a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he carried a scarred aluminum case of the type plumbers and electricians use. His hair was white and cropped close, and he moved the way very old buildings move when they haven't fallen yet, carefully, deliberately, with a structural integrity that was not immediately obvious. He had clearly come in through the wrong door. "Sir," Tatum said, taking a step toward him, "this is a restricted area. How did you get access to this corridor?" The man looked up at her. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of weathered concrete, and they registered her presence with a calm so complete it was almost impersonal. "Came to fix the HVAC secondary return on the south wall," he said. His voice was low and level, the kind of voice that had given orders for so long it no longer needed to raise itself to be obeyed. "Building services sent me. Got a work order." He produced a folded paper from his shirt pocket without looking at it, as if he had simply known it would be needed. Nystrom stepped forward to take it. His eyes flicked to the document and back to the man, and something shifted in his expression. Ma'am, the order checks out." The dogs had not stopped, but they had changed again. They were watching the old man with an intensity that was different from anything they had shown in the past days. It wasn't aggression. Tatum could not quite name what it was. The man paid the dogs no special attention. He didn't ignore them, exactly, but he didn't perform awareness of them either. He simply moved through the space, his aluminum case in his hand, heading toward the south wall with the unhurried purpose of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Ajax stopped spinning. Tatum noticed it the way you notice when a noise you've stopped consciously hearing suddenly stops altogether. The absence was louder than the sound had been. The Malinois stood at the front of his run, rigid, his amber eyes tracking the old man's path with an alertness that was entirely different from the chaos of a minute ago. Then Ranger stopped. Then one by one, all 7, not cowering, not subdued. They were standing at their fences with the posture of soldiers called to attention, their bodies still, their eyes following the man who had not once looked directly at them. Tatum stood very still. Nystrom had gone completely silent beside her. The old man set his case down near the south wall unit and crouched to examine a panel. He worked without haste, checking connections, running his fingers along conduit with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood systems. The dogs watched him. Not one of them made a sound. After perhaps 3 minutes of this, without turning his head, the man spoke a single word. It was quiet, not a command volume. The kind of register you use when you know you're already being listened to. Ruhig, German. It meant roughly quiet. Settle. Be still. The effect was total. 7 dogs settled simultaneously into a rest position, chins dropping, muscles releasing, the coiled tension bleeding out of them as if someone had opened a valve. Nystrom made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Tatum was already moving toward the old man. "Sir." Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I need to know who you are." The man rose to his feet with the deliberateness of someone whose knees had opinions. He looked at her directly for the first time, and there was something in that look that she recognized without being able to name, the particular quality of someone who had seen consequences that could not be undone and had made peace with that and kept going. "Name's Gilbert Cray," he said. "I fix things. You just calmed 7 dogs that a full handler team couldn't approach." "Didn't calm them," Cray said. He looked toward the runs with an expression that was not quite neutral. "They calmed themselves. I just gave them something to do it for." He turned back to the south wall panel, the conversation apparently concluded. Tatum had spent 15 years in animal behavior. She had worked with high-drive working dogs, with combat trauma cases, with animals that had survived things that broke human beings. She had never seen anything like what had just happened. "Mr. Cray." She heard the edge in her own voice. "Those animals have been in acute crisis for 11 days. Our most experienced handlers have been unable to establish any safe contact. You walked in here and said one word." Cray's hands paused on the panel for a moment. He didn't turn around. "They weren't responding to handlers," he said. "They were responding to uncertainty. Everything around them is uncertain. The people, the routine, the purpose. Dogs like these, they don't need reassurance. They need structure. They need to believe the person in the room knows what they're doing. He resumed his work. Most people, when they're afraid of a dog, think very loudly. These dogs hear it. Nystrom said very quietly, "He's right." Tatum looked at the corporal. Nystrom was staring at the old man with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that combined bewilderment and recognition. "Mr. Cray," she said, making a decision she couldn't fully justify, "would you be willing to walk with me for a few minutes after you're finished?" He was quiet for a moment. "Got 2 more stops on the work order," he said. "Give me 20 minutes. She waited outside with Nystrom and said nothing. The dogs remained quiet. She checked the incident log again without reading it. When Cray emerged through the main door, he was carrying his case, and the flannel was back and rolled to the wrists. He stood in the pale March light and looked at her with the expression of someone who had already decided how much of himself he intended to share, and it was a very specific and limited amount. "How long have you been working with dogs?" she asked. "Long time," he said. "Professionally." He looked at something past her shoulder. "You could call it that. Mr. Cray, I'm going to be direct with you. Those animals are 3 days from a welfare review that will likely result in euthanasia for 2 of them. I have a congressional review in 6 weeks. I have a program that exists to help veterans and to honor these dogs' service, and I cannot get it functional because I cannot get these animals stable. What I just watched you do in that room is the only thing I have seen in 11 days that worked." She held his gaze. "I'd like your help." He said nothing for a long moment. He set his case down on the concrete and looked at it. His hands, she noticed for the first time, were wrong for a maintenance man. The palms were calloused in the specific pattern of someone who had held taut lines under pressure for years. His knuckles were thickened in a way she recognized from dog trainers she had known, the particular deformation that came from a decade of the same grip on the same kind of equipment. "Those dogs aren't broken," he said finally. "They're waiting. You understand the difference? Tell me, broken means something's gone. Waiting means it's there and no one's asked for it." He looked toward the building. "Every one of them in there still knows their job, still knows who they're supposed to be. Nobody's asked them to be it in almost a year, in some cases longer. They're not going crazy. They're going unused. And for a dog with that much training, that much drive, that much purpose built into them since they were 8 weeks old." He stopped. "It's a particular kind of suffering." Tatum said nothing. She had a feeling that speaking would interrupt something. "My work order's got 2 more stops," he said. "I know." He picked up his case. "I'll be back through this corridor Thursday morning, 7:30. He looked at her once, a flat, assessing look. "Have Corporal Nystrom there. And nobody else." He walked away without waiting for her answer. On Thursday at 7:15, Tatum was in her office pretending to review intake files. At 7:28, she heard his boots on the concrete outside. She stayed where she was. What she learned later from Nystrom's report and from her own careful observation over the days that followed, she assembled into a picture that didn't fit any framework she had been trained in. Cray arrived with no equipment except his aluminum case, which that morning contained not tools but 6 worn leather leads and a small cloth bag that smelled of dried herbs and something mineral she couldn't identify. He did not go to the center of the room. He stood just inside the door and breathed deliberately for almost a full minute, and Nystrom told her later that the dogs settled in stages during that minute, the way a room full of people settles when someone they trust walks in. Then he went to Ajax first. The Malinois who had been spinning for days was standing quietly, watching him. Cray didn't approach the fence. He sat down on the floor 3 feet from the run, cross-legged, and was still. Ajax pressed his nose to the fence grating. Cray spoke too low for Nystrom to hear. He spoke for several minutes. The words weren't commands. Their cadence was different, slower, the rhythm of someone explaining rather than directing. Ajax lay down, his chin on the concrete, his amber eyes fixed on the man. After a while, Cray rose and unlatched the run. Ajax came out and sat at his left side with a precision that Nystrom, in his report, called parade ground perfect. He went to Booker next. With the Dutch shepherd, who had been refusing food, he did something different. He placed his hand flat on the ground outside the run and waited until the dog came to sniff it, which took 11 minutes. He didn't move the hand during those 11 minutes. He simply waited with the patience of something geological. Then Vega, the Belgian Malinois female who had been the most volatile, who had put the handler in the hospital with the fractured wrist. With her, Cray stood outside the run and turned sideways, presenting not his face but his profile, reducing himself, and he made a sound that wasn't a word, a low, continuous tone that Nystrom compared in his report to something between a hum and a sigh. And Vega, who had not allowed a human within 10 feet of her without screaming fury, walked to the fence and pressed her face against the chain link and made a small, thin sound of almost unbearable longing. Within 90 minutes, all 7 dogs were out. They moved around him in a loose constellation, not clustered, not crowding him, each at a precise distance that seemed individually calibrated, as if each dog had its own specific relationship to the man and understood its place within it. Ranger, the largest, the most decorated, walked at his left heel without a lead, matching his pace with the accuracy of a shadow. Nystrom told her afterward that he had cried, quietly against the wall. He was not embarrassed about it. Cray returned the dogs to their runs one by one, each with the same unhurried ceremony. He told Nystrom 3 things before he left, and Nystrom wrote them down verbatim and brought them to Tatum that afternoon. The first, the dogs needed a job that was theirs, not borrowed. Even a daily perimeter walk with a consistent route and a clear purpose was enough. They needed to be professionals again, not patients. The second, every handler working with them needed to understand that the dogs were reading their internal state more accurately than any questionnaire ever developed. Your airmen go home at night and worry about whether they're doing it right, he said. The dogs feel that worry and interpret it as a sign that something's wrong. You need to train your people to be calm the way these animals are calm, which isn't the absence of feeling but the management of it. The third, Ajax's left rear knee was inflamed. It wouldn't show on a visual inspection, but he'd been compensating for 3 weeks. Get the vet to look at the medial joint specifically. The vet confirmed it the next morning. Tatum requested a background check on Gilbert Cray through standard channels that afternoon. The request came back clean, which was itself a kind of information. A name, an address in a small town 40 miles east, a contractor's license issued 11 years ago. No military service record, no federal employment history. Nothing before the contractor's license except a birth record and a social security number that had been largely inactive for a period of what appeared to be roughly 3 decades. She had a colleague run a secondary search through less official channels, the kind of search that found things that had been filed under classifications that were downgraded but not destroyed. That search came back with nothing, which her colleague told her, quietly, was also a kind of answer. There was a specific bureaucratic texture to a record that didn't exist because it had never been created, and a different texture to one that didn't exist because someone had decided it shouldn't. Gilbert Cray's absence in the databases had the second texture. She didn't pursue it further. She wasn't sure she was cleared for what she might find, and she was equally unsure she wanted to know. He came back twice more in the following weeks, each time through the maintenance corridor, each time with a work order that was technically legitimate, each time carrying the aluminum case. Each time, he spent between 1 and 2 hours with the dogs and left specific, concrete guidance for Nystrom and the other handlers that was so practical and so immediately effective that Nystrom started keeping a dedicated notebook. The transformation in Building 14 was the kind that people who hadn't witnessed the before and after simply didn't believe when they heard about it described. The dogs that had been destroying themselves and each other were now running daily patrol routes with young handlers who had learned under Cray's indirect instruction to breathe differently, to think differently, to bring their nervous systems into a state that the animals recognized as trustworthy. Ajax's knee was treated, and he moved again with the fluid economy of a working animal. Vega, who had fractured a man's wrist, allowed a 22-year-old specialist named Kowalski to groom her every morning while she leaned her whole weight against his leg and watched the door for threats that no longer manifested. The Congressional Review came in on a Thursday. The observers walked through Building 14 at 9 in the morning and watched 7 retired military working dogs perform a search exercise with absolute precision and complete calm. The subcommittee chair, a man who had spent 20 years in the Marine Corps before politics, stood at the fence and watched Ranger execute a grid search pattern and didn't say anything for a full minute. The program was funded for 3 years. Tatum found out the following week that Cray had not been back. His last work order in the building services system had been submitted the day before the review, and when she called the maintenance contractor to ask about future scheduling, she was told that Gilbert Cray had turned in his contractor badge the previous Friday. He had left no forwarding information. A package arrived at her office on a Tuesday afternoon. No return address, postmarked from a rural route box that, when she looked it up, corresponded to a township with no town center in it. Inside was a bundle of photocopied documents, some of them typed on paper that had clearly been old when it was copied, some handwritten in the compact vertical print of someone trained to write under difficult conditions. They were training notes, not program manuals, not official doctrine. Personal notes, the kind someone makes for themselves, full of observations and questions and small diagrams of body posture and kennel layout and the geometry of trust. At the bottom of the bundle was a single photograph, black and white, the grain of it suggesting the 1980s. A younger man, lean and hard-angled in a way that made it obvious, even without context, that this was someone who had spent years in physical exertion that was not voluntary. He was in the photograph with a dog, a German shepherd of the kind that no longer gets bred precisely that way. All working bone and hard muscle and absolute focus. The man and the dog were looking at each other. There were trees in the background that didn't look like American trees. The man was not in uniform. He was not in anything identifiable. On the back, in the same compact print, "You can't train a dog to trust you. You have to earn it the same way you earn anything worth having." Slowly, in full view, without guarantees, Tatum had the photograph framed. She hung it in Building 14, near the door to the exercise yard, where every handler who came through the program would pass it on their way in and their way out. Most of them asked about it. She told them what she knew, which wasn't much, and what she believed, which was more. She believed that Gilbert Cray had been doing some version of this work for longer than most of the handlers had been alive. She believed that the 3 decades of silence in his federal record corresponded to something that had taken place in countries that weren't acknowledged, and in units that weren't named, and that somewhere in the long subtraction of that life were dogs whose service was remembered by no official record, but who had been seen, fully and clearly, by at least one man who understood what they were. She believed that whatever he had done and wherever he had gone, he had not walked into Building 14 by accident. She thought about that sometimes, late in the afternoon, watching Ranger lead a young handler in tight, purposeful circles around the exercise yard, the dog's head high and his movement precise, and everything that had been broken in him rebuilt into something that looked, from the right angle, like dignity. The leash between them was slack. It didn't need to be anything else. The dog knew where he was going, and so did the man, and between them there was a language that nobody had taught either one of them from a manual, a language assembled from 10,000 small moments of showing up and being present and not flinching, and it held. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.